The harbor smelled like diesel and dead kelp, and Mara Voss had stopped noticing it years ago. She noticed it now, though. Standing at the end of the dock with her boots soaked through and the radio crackling nothing but static, she noticed it the way you noticed the last time you ever smell something. With all of you, suddenly, all at once. The water was wrong. She'd been a marine salvage operator for 11 years on this stretch of the Atlantic coast, and she knew wrong water the way a baker knows a bad oven. The surface tension was off. Flat in places, it shouldn't be flat. Moving in places, the current had no business moving. The gulls had stopped working the shoreline 2 hours ago, and that was the thing nobody else had clocked yet. Not the harbor master, not the Coast Guard relay, not any of the 3 divers she'd sent down since dawn and not gotten back. She keyed her radio again. "Kelso, fam, anyone, come up, right now, static." Behind her, across the parking lot that separated the marina from the town of Caro Point, a woman named Deirdre Oakes was pinning laundry to a line and watching Mara with the particular incuriosity of someone who'd lived beside the water long enough to stop being surprised by it. Deirdre's husband had gone missing off a fishing charter 4 years back. She still did the laundry. She still watched the water. She'd simply reorganized her expectations of it. Mara pulled off her headset and looked down. 60 feet below the dock, barely visible through the murk, something pulsed. Not a fish. Not a current anomaly. Not a thermal bloom. Not any of the rational explanations she was rapidly exhausting. It pulsed the way a heartbeat pulses, with intention. A slow, deep, rhythmic compression of light that shouldn't have been down there at all. She picked up her dive bag. She put it back down. She picked it up again. The thing about Mara Voss was this. She had a particular relationship with decisions she already knew she'd made. She'd argue against them, sometimes for whole minutes, while her hands went ahead and got everything ready. Her hands were already pulling on her wetsuit. She went down alone, which was stupid, and she knew it was stupid, which made it a choice rather than a mistake. The visibility was maybe 8 feet in any direction. The seafloor here was 20 meters down, a scrubby rock shelf dense with kelp columns, and the rusted debris of a century of maritime traffic. She'd recovered 3 separate anchor chains from this patch, a ship's bell from something that might have been a rum runner, 2 human remains, once each, from incidents she didn't discuss at dinner. She followed the pulse. It led her past the rock shelf, into a depression she'd never mapped, which shouldn't have been possible given how many dives she'd done in this cove. Depressions don't appear. She descended another 10 meters she hadn't budgeted for, and then she saw it. The ship, if you could call it that, was the length of 3 football fields laid end to end, and it was matte black in a way that had nothing to do with paint. Black the way an absence is black. Black the way the space between stars is black, not dark, but actually absent of the concept of light. It sat on the sea floor at a slight angle, the rear quarter buried in sediment, and from its underside a faint violet luminescence radiated outward in concentric rings, slow and steady as a breathing thing. The pulse. Around it, in a loose orbit, were the sharks, not circling the wreck the way a predator circles wounded prey, orbiting, maintaining precise radial distance. Their movements were synchronized in a way that made Mara's stomach turn before her brain caught up to explaining why. Because sharks don't synchronize. Sharks are singular. Sharks are the oldest perfect killing machine evolution ever bothered to finish. They don't school. They don't coordinate. They don't move in formation like they're components of a single larger machine receiving instructions from a central hub. These did. She counted 7 visible. Great whites, most of them, though the leftmost animal was something bigger, a bull, maybe, or something she didn't have a taxonomic category for yet. They moved with the unhurried certainty of things that had forgotten they needed to be afraid of anything. Mara held very still and did the thing she was best at, which was thinking fast while appearing to do nothing at all. She counted her air, counted the distance back to the surface, counted the sharks, counted the exits from the depression that didn't require passing through the orbit, found 2. One was narrow, probably a squeeze, definitely a risk. One was wide open and lit by the violet pulse from below, which meant anything watching from the ship. And she was becoming increasingly convinced that something was watching from the ship would have a perfect sightline to it. She took the narrow one. She breached the surface 60 meters from the dock, spit out her regulator, and made absolutely no sound, because the 2 men she could see standing on the dock were not men she recognized from Caro Point. They were in dark clothing without logos or insignia. One was talking quietly into something that wasn't a phone. The shape was wrong, too flat, too wide. The other was watching the water with the focused patience of something that had been watching water for a very long time and was not in any hurry. Mara floated on her back, as still as a corpse, and thought about Kelso and Fam. She thought about the 3 days of dive prep she'd done for the recovery job that had brought her back to this cove. An automated log buoy, snagged on the bottom, nothing exotic. The client was a research firm out of Halifax, routine. She thought about how the research firm's contact had called her specifically 3 weeks ago, out of the blue, when her number wasn't listed anywhere she could account for. She thought about the absence of birds. She swam to the far end of the breakwater, out of sightline, and climbed out on the rocks. The town of Carroll Point had, in addition to its marina, a hardware store, a diner, a seasonal lobster pound, a harbormaster's office that also served as the de facto police substation when the county sheriff's deputy wasn't available, and a woman named Greta Holt, who had been holding unofficial town council meetings in her living room for 30 years because the official ones were, in her words, decorative. Mara went to Greta. She found 3 other people already there. Deirdre Oakes, who had apparently abandoned her laundry, a retired Navy man named Cal Prudo, who lived above the hardware store, and who Mara had always assumed was insane, but was now revising upward, and a teenage boy named Wyatt, who was Greta's grandnephew, and who had driven in from the county seat that morning, because, he said, he'd been picking up something on the radio band he used for his storm-chasing hobby. Something that wasn't weather. Show her, Greta said. Wyatt put a tablet on the kitchen table. The signal visualization was running on a loop, a waveform that looked biological, almost cardiac, repeating on a 19-second interval. Mara sat down heavily. There's a ship, she said, on the bottom of the cove, bigger than anything we built. It's controlling the sharks. No one at the table expressed surprise. That, more than anything else, told her how bad things were. Cal Prudo poured coffee into a mug that said World's Okayest Grandpa and slid it across the table. How long do you think it's been down there? I don't know. The sediment coverage on the aft section suggests weeks, minimum, maybe longer. She wrapped her hands around the mug. My divers didn't come back up. Silence. The men on the dock, Deirdre said. I've been watching them for 2 days. There are 4 of them total. They know about the ship. Government? Mara asked. Something like government, Deirdre said, which was a very precise way of saying something that required precision. Greta, who was 73 and had the posture of a much younger woman and the patience of a very old mountain, folded her hands on the table and said, What does it want? That was the question, and the answer took them 3 hours to piece together. The waveform data that Wyatt had been collecting for 72 hours without understanding what he had, the shipping manifests that Cal had pulled from public records, because he was the kind of retired Navy man who never fully retired. The pattern of disappearances along this stretch of coast over the past 6 weeks that nobody had officially connected because they belonged to different jurisdictions and involved different activities, and Mara's own observations from the bottom of the cove. The ship had come down in pieces. That was Cal's read, and he walked them through it with the methodical calm of someone who'd spent 30 years analyzing threat vectors. Not a crash landing, a deliberate dispersal. The largest section, the one Mara had found, was the core. The other sections had been scattered across a 40-mile radius of seafloor, presumably to complicate detection. It's staging, Cal said. Whatever comes next, this is the preparation. The sharks are the forward screen. A forward screen for what? Wyatt asked. Cal looked at his coffee. Something that needs the water secured before it moves to the next phase. Something amphibious, Mara said. Cal nodded. There are things on that ship, Mara said. I didn't see them, but I know they were watching me. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the fog had come in off the water, thick and close and unusually still for this time of year, no wind to drive it. Mara thought about the ship's pulse and wondered if the fog was coincidental. She decided it wasn't. We have until dark, she said. I think we have until dark. What followed was not a military operation. It was not a government response or a coordinated emergency protocol or any of the other procedural architectures that humans had built for exactly this kind of moment. It was 5 people in a fishing town with whatever they had on hand, which turned out to be more than nothing but less than enough. So they made the difference themselves. Cal had diving equipment from his Navy years, older but functional. He had a rebreather he'd maintained out of habit, And he had the kind of knowledge about underwater demolition that the Navy doesn't officially let you keep, but which tends to stay with you anyway, lodged somewhere between muscle memory and terrible dreams. Deirdre had her husband's boat, a 38-foot lobster rig that she'd kept running since he disappeared because letting it rot felt too much like a decision she didn't want to make. The boat had a winch rated to 2 tons and a fish finder sonar that was better than anything else in the harbor by a wide margin. Wyatt had the signal data and a mind that processed spatial information the way some people process language, intuitively, at speed, without needing to be taught the grammar. He understood the waveform within an hour of having a context for it, which was faster than Mara would have given him credit for before today. Greta had the keys to the harbor master's office, and, it turned out, a relationship with someone at NOAA who wasn't government, but who understood the kind of unofficial situation that Caro Point was currently in. That call took 4 minutes. What it unlocked, Greta didn't fully explain, but her expression afterward was the particular expression of someone who has moved a piece they weren't supposed to be able to move. Mara had the ship's location, her own dive data, and the specific, unreasonable stubbornness that had kept her in business in an industry that ate most people within 5 years. They spent an hour building a plan that Cal, to his credit, didn't call a plan. He called it a sequence of actions with acceptable probability of partial success, which was military for long shot, but also, incidentally, the most honest description of any plan Mara had ever heard. The 4 men on the dock were the first problem. They were waiting for something. The ship's next transmission, the beginning of the next phase, some signal from below that hadn't come yet. They were patient in the way that patience becomes its own kind of tell, the way a man who is absolutely certain of something stops checking his watch. They weren't checking anything. They were just present, arranged at the dock, watching the water that they knew was theirs. Deirdre walked past them at 4 in the afternoon with a bucket of chum for crab traps. She wasn't actually setting. She'd been walking this dock since she could walk. She belonged here in a way that made her invisible, and she used it the way she used every other tool she had. Quietly, without announcement, without wasting it. She planted the sonar repeater Cal had rigged under the dock's middle piling, 2 inches of waterproof putty and a magnetic coupling. Took her 4 seconds. The men didn't look at her. At 6, Wyatt began broadcasting a modified version of the ship's own signal back at itself. Not a perfect mirror, but close enough to introduce interference. Close enough to buy confusion. He did this from the back of his truck, parked behind the Lobster Pound, hunched over his equipment with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly the thing they were made to do. "How long?" Mara asked him. "Long enough," he said, and she believed him, and that was the kind of faith that doesn't come from certainty but from paying attention. She went back in the water at dusk. Cal was 30 meters to her left, moving toward the secondary section of the wreck that his analysis of the sonar data had identified. They moved without lights, navigating by the ship's own pulse, which Mara had by now internalized to the point where it felt like her heartbeat instead of something alien. The sharks were still there, but they were, and she had no better word for it, distracted. Their orbit had shifted. The perfect synchronized radial formation had degraded into something more like a confused shoal. Animals bumping the edges of their programmed paths, some of them hanging nearly motionless in the water, in a way that great whites almost never do, because great whites have to keep moving to breathe. Wyatt's interference was working. She went past them, close enough that the nearest animal, the big bull or whatever it was, turned its head toward her with one flat black eye. She met the eye. She'd learned long ago that panicking at a shark was a choice, like panicking at anything else, natural, available, optional. She chose not to. The eye tracked her. Then the interference pulse stuttered through the water, a vibration she felt in her jaw and her sternum, and the shark turned away as if it had forgotten she existed. She descended. Up close, the ship was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected something extraordinary. The material wasn't metal. Not any alloy she recognized, not any texture she had a referent for. It was somewhere between ceramic and cartilage, smooth in some places and corrugated in others in patterns that looked deliberate, structural, maybe linguistic. She pressed a gloved hand against the hull and felt nothing, and then felt something, a faint warmth, the temperature of a living thing, the heat of metabolism. The hull was alive, or it contained something alive, or it was made from something that had once been alive and still remembered it. There was an opening. Not a hatch in any conventional sense, no visible seams, no hardware, no mechanism. Just a place where the hull curved inward and resolved into a passage that her body would fit through if she oriented correctly, which she determined by looking at it for a long time with the part of her brain that solves spatial problems and trusting what it told her. She went in. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, which she filed under things to be troubled by later when she had time. The light was violet, diffuse, sourceless. The architecture, if that was the word, was organic in a way that made all built human spaces feel suddenly arbitrary, as if right angles were a local custom no one else had adopted. And they were there. 2 of them. In the center of the chamber, which was larger than Greta's entire house, at a console that looked like it had grown out of the floor rather than been placed on it. They were not looking at her. They were doing something with the console that involved all 4 of their upper limbs simultaneously, a rapid, fluid manipulation that made the DJ comparison from the film reviews suddenly feel inadequate, because this was more like watching a pianist and a surgeon operating at the same time on the same instrument. They were managing the sharks, managing the interference. Managing, she realized as she held very still and watched. Whatever it was, they were trying to manage her, trying to reinstate the signal why it was scrambling, to bring their forward screen back under control before the disruption progressed. They had not registered her. She understood, in that moment, something important. They had not been watching her earlier. She had felt certain of it, and she'd been wrong, and the wrongness mattered because it meant their model of this situation did not include a human diver infiltrating the ship on foot alone, without backup. It was not a contingency they'd planned against, because who would do that? She almost laughed. She kept it internal. Cal's package was already primed. She could see his signal light blinking from the device she'd carried in, and which she now attached to the cartilage wall. With the same mechanical calm with which she did everything, the calm that wasn't confidence exactly, but was confidence's practical cousin. She set the timer. She had 4 minutes. She looked at the beings at the console for one more moment. One of them, the left one, had a quality to its posture that she recognized. Frustration. The particular set of a body that cannot make a thing work the way it's supposed to work. The signal was still scrambled, and it couldn't unfold the reason why. And this was, somehow, deeply familiar to her. This was what every human being looked like in the moment before they started improvising. She felt something strange, not quite sympathy, more like recognition. Then she left. She came up in the dark, well past the dock, and Deirdre's boat was exactly where it was supposed to be. "Cal?" Deirdre said. "Coming," Mara said. 40 seconds, maybe. Cal surfaced 90 seconds later, which was 40 seconds over, but close enough. He hauled himself over the gunwale without assistance, because he was the kind of man who did that, and he nodded at Mara, and Mara nodded back, and Deirdre opened the throttle. They were 300 meters out when the bottom of the cove lit up. Not an explosion, exactly, or not just an explosion. The violet pulse that had been the ship's heartbeat suddenly expanded, ballooned upward through the water column, broke the surface in a dome of phosphorescence that turned the fog white and then purple, and then slowly, over the course of 15 or 20 seconds that felt much longer, faded. The sharks surfaced, all of them simultaneously rolling belly up in the glowing water. Not dead. They righted themselves after a moment, and she could see them at the edge of the light, massive shapes reorienting, the programmed coordination entirely gone from their movement now. Just sharks again. Just singular, purposeful, magnificently indifferent animals rediscovering what they were, going back to being the oldest perfect thing evolution ever finished. One of them crossed directly under the boat's keel. Mara watched its shape pass through the depth sounder. "Go ahead and go," she said quietly. The shark went. Greta's contact at NOAA sent a research vessel that arrived at dawn, flying an unusual flag configuration that Cal spent 10 minutes studying before announcing that it wasn't NOAA or any American naval registry, but that he recognized it and that they were, in his assessment, the right people to be here. Mara didn't ask follow-up questions. She was the kind of person who knew when she'd reached the edge of what she was equipped to do and was content to hand the thing off cleanly. She gave the research team her dive data, her visual account, the sonar records from the repeater Deirdre had planted, and Wyatt's waveform logs. She kept one thing: a chip of material she'd collected from the ship's hull, smaller than her thumbnail, smooth, still faintly warm. She'd had a feeling she'd want it later, And she trusted her feelings the way she trusted her spatial instincts, which was provisionally, but with respect. She sat on the dock with it in her palm, and Deirdre sat beside her, and they watched the research team work in the way that people who have done the hard part of something watch others do the administrative follow-through. "What do you think they were after?" Deirdre asked. "I don't know." Mara turned the chip in her fingers. "I think they thought it would be easier." Deirdre looked at the water. "Because of the sharks? Because of everything." Mara pocketed the chip. "They had a working theory about what this place was, about what we'd do." She paused. "They were wrong about us." Deirdre was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband's still down there somewhere. I know. I'd like to find him. When this is done." "When this is done," Mara said, "I'll take you down myself." The fog was burning off. The birds were coming back to the shoreline, slowly, uncertainly, checking first before committing, which was intelligent behavior, and probably why birds had outlasted so many things that were in theory better equipped to survive. The gulls hit the water and came up with fish and went to the rocks to eat them. And it was deeply, completely ordinary. And for a long moment, neither woman spoke, because the ordinary was the thing you missed when you'd been close enough to something that might have ended it. Cal came down the dock with 3 mugs of coffee. He hadn't slept either. He looked like he never needed to sleep, which Mara suspected was partly true and partly performance, and she respected both. "That kid," he said, meaning Wyatt, "is going to be someone worth knowing." "He already is," Greta said, appearing behind him in the way Greta always appeared, fully formed, from nowhere, as if she'd always been there and you'd simply failed to notice. She had her phone in one hand, and the expression of a woman who had been making difficult calls and would make more. "The secondary rec sections are still down there. They're going to need more divers." Mara looked at the water. The same water she'd been looking at for 11 years. The same surface that gave nothing away, that held its secrets at depth, that asked to be taken seriously and punished you when you didn't. "I know some people," she said. Of course she did. 3 weeks later, a paper was published in a journal that almost nobody read. It described, in deliberately technical language, the discovery of non-terrestrial manufactured materials at multiple sites in the North Atlantic, attributed to what the authors called an uncharacterized deep-sea geological event. The paper had 7 authors, none of them from anywhere Mara had heard of. It said nothing about the sharks, nothing about Caro Point, nothing about 5 people in a kitchen deciding to do something about a problem that was, by any reasonable assessment, too large for them. Mara read it over breakfast. She noted what was in it and what wasn't. She filed it under things she knew that papers wouldn't say, which was a large file and growing. Then she drove down to the marina, checked her gear, and took Deirdre out. The water was cold and clear, and they went down together into the place where the ship had been. The ship was gone. The research team had done something thorough there, though what exactly, neither of them had been told. The depression in the seafloor was raw and new, the sediment disturbed, the rocks exposed that hadn't seen current in a long time. Deirdre found what she'd been looking for 30 minutes in a crevice 30 meters down, and Mara held the light steady while Deirdre did what she needed to do, which was a private thing, and which Mara gave her full privacy for by watching the water instead. The water was just water now, cold and dark and full of things that lived there without asking permission, without explaining themselves, without needing to be understood. A shark passed at the edge of the visibility, heading east with the absolute singular purpose that sharks had always had and always would have, long before anything had tried to bend it to a different use and long after anything ever tried again. Mara watched it go. She thought, "We are so strange, we things that came out of this water, so strange and so stubborn and so particular about what belongs to whom." She turned off the extra light to save the battery. She waited for Deirdre in the dark. She wasn't afraid. She'd stopped being afraid of the dark somewhere on the way down, the same place she'd stopped being afraid of a lot of things. Not because the dark was safe, but because being afraid of it cost more than she was willing to pay, and she'd found better things to do with that particular currency. When Deirdre was ready, they went up. They broke the surface into cold October air and the smell of diesel and dead kelp, and Mara noticed it again, noticed it the way you notice something you'd been missing, the way a place becomes yours again after something has tried to take it. She spit out her regulator. She looked at the town on the hill above the harbor, white clapboard and smoke from chimneys, and the seasonal lobster pound advertising prices on a board that hadn't been updated in 3 weeks. And she thought, you don't know what almost happened here. She didn't mind. She minded it a little. But mostly she didn't. The harbor smelled like diesel and dead kelp, and Mara Voss had stopped noticing it years ago. Today she noticed it with everything she had, and it was enough.